This is Module 4, Part 2 of Anatomy and Physiology. Okie dokie, if you would take out your notes. We're on page 3 of them, near the bottom. So we actually did okay the last time. We kind of moved along. We've got more to do today, but I think we'll do just fine. So that's on page 107 in terms of corresponding with the textbook. Let's see, what we got? I think, yeah. Oh, okie dokie. You are there, Jacob. Welcome, buddy. And I got your stuff too, Jacob. So I just got to open it and give you credit. Glad you're here today. So, bone homeostasis. Of course, we remember that term and the importance of it from the very first module. The idea of the necessity to maintain appropriate levels throughout the body, and that includes a lot of different things. Bone homeostasis, I'm reading from your notes. Ways in which the skeletal system ensures homeostasis. That's the state of equilibrium in the body with respect to its function, its chemical levels, and its tissues. So that's homeostasis in general, but bone homeostasis, as we will see, has to do with a variety of minerals, and especially calcium. The endocrine system is responsible for hormones in the body, but in terms of these particular compounds, let's look at them. So the thyroid gland in front of the neck, at the base of the neck, secretes calcitonin, and it's involved in regulating the concentration of calcium in the blood. So in terms of the homeostasis of that vital mineral, calcium, the thyroid gland is involved as well. The parathyroid glands are embedded in the four corners of the thyroid. They are essential for life as well. They produce parathyroid hormone, that is PTH, that regulates the concentration of calcium ions in the bloodstream. So the parathyroid glands then are also very involved in this crucial mineral, calcium. The concentration of calcium affects many processes in the body. For example, low levels, nerves become overactive and stimulate muscles such that they cannot relax. Clenched fingers, worse, muscles that control the diaphragm stop contracting. So you don't think about I don't walk around thinking, man, I hope my calcium levels are good, but the reality is calcium is absolutely vital to who you are and to your living. Muscles controlling the diaphragm stop contracting, and of course the result there is asphyxiation. On page 4, if you turn over to page 4, calcium levels, is that a hand or is that a stretch? That's a stretch?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Also, I thought calcium just affected your bones.
And we're dealing with that right now, absolutely. In terms of the strength of bones. Absolutely. And this process of maintaining calcium levels for other aspects of the body, one of which we just mentioned, as you age, if you're not adding calcium, if you're not eating foods and elderly people tend to do that. They tend to restrict diet into things that they prefer. And a lot of times they're not high in calcium. So calcium is leached from the bones, and so that whole idea of broken bones and brittle bones in older people is a reality. So the necessity for either in improving the diet or supplementing with calcium supplements is really important. So I think probably all of us, if you haven't yet, you will have an elderly relative who will have a broken bone and a broken hip. I mean, we break bones throughout life, at least some of us, repeatedly. But that we don't usually think of that as life-threatening. But in an elderly person, the processes that that come after a hip, say, is broken can very often result in it being life-threatening for them. It's kind of a cascading effect in other aspects of life. Well, I'm on the top of page 4. Calcium levels are maintained, and thank you for the question. Thank you for the point. Calcium levels are maintained by negative feedback, and remember, negative feedback is good. Positive feedback is bad, all right, for the most part. When calcium levels drop, parathyroid glands detect that decrease and they release PTH, which causes the osteoclasts to increase bone breakdown, which releases calcium into the blood, all right? We talked about that. PTH also stimulates the kidneys to decrease the amount of calcium in the urine and stimulates the production of vitamin D in the skin, which then increases the amount of calcium that the body can absorb from food. So again, see these positive, negative feedback aspects of maintaining homeostasis. High calcium levels is controlled by another negative feedback system. The thyroid gland detects an increase in blood calcium and secretes calcitonin, which decreases the activity of the osteoclasts, so bone is not destroyed as quickly, so that the blood levels of the calcium decrease, and in that way restoring homeostasis. Also, the parathyroid detects high levels and produces less PTH, which also causes a decrease in osteoclast activity. PTH levels are probably the more important calcium lowering function. So in terms of maintaining homeostasis, it's really the PTH that helps drive that. Human growth hormone, and HGH. And in terms of this stuff, we saw we had a negative feedback rendering, I guess you'd say that, earlier. Again, I think it was not the first or second module. but on page 108, you have one there for calcium regulation, which is kind of helpful. I don't include it in your notes. That's something you might want to draw, get a little extra credit, have something to refer to. But HGH is discussed on page 109 if you're somebody that likes to follow along in the textbook. What I require of you, though, is in your notes. The human growth hormone, HGH, is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, located at the base of the brain in the front, that's the anterior, and is actually two glands which are quite different. The HGH stimulates tissue growth, other tissues beside bone, but bone is an important target issue. HGH stimulates osteoblast activity, which grows bone. Too little HGH during childhood leads to something called dwarfism. That's the little people that we sometimes refer to. Much smaller than average human size is what dwarfism is. Too much HGH causes bones to grow too rapidly, resulting in giantism. So Andre the Giant, any of you remember him from the wrestling days? He's been gone for some time now, but and he was in a movie or two. But that's Andre the Giant. Yes?
Actually, an interesting thing, I wondered what was the world record for being the tallest. So it was way back in like the 20s, I think, like when pictures were black and white and stuff like that. And this man was so huge. He was like taller, way taller than his family. Like he was like ginormous. Like I think the record was 10.5 feet.
Wow. Likely the result of some overproduction of HGH in his childhood. And it has to be childhood because that's when bone growth is extending the length of the long bones. In adulthood, that growth stops. Remember, we've discussed that already, and apositional bone growth takes place, and that results in a thickening of bone. And we described the results of that in athletes who take HGH to enhance their performance. And I've shared with you my brother and his struggle with acromegaly. He had a tumor on his pituitary, which produced more HGH and resulted in the same apositional bone growth, which I mean, it's very difficult on the body, is what it is, and joints, back. He struggles today with pain in just about everywhere. His shoulders now, he's had 2 knee replacements, a hip replacement. We just lost Jacob, okay? And hopefully we're still up. This thing is a challenge sometimes.
Technology's crazy.
Pardon?
Technology's crazy sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see, giantism, specifically taller than the average human height. When HGH levels grow in adulthood, the epiphyseal plates are already ossified, that's what we just said. So bone no longer grows longer, instead it grows thicker at the brow, the hands, or the feet. And so again, in terms of athletes from the past, because there's tests for that stuff now, and you know, guys still cheat, women use it too, and cheat, but it's happening with less frequency. But the way to tell was these guys with the great big Cro-Magnon, you know, Neanderthal brows and massive heads. Sadly, my brother struggles not so much from the brow, but from the enlargement of his head. He's got a big head, I always tell him. Let's continue though. Sex hormones and estrogen and testosterone. Let's see, that's at the bottom of page 109. Not a lot there in the textbook, but I've given it all to you in your notes. They stimulate osteoblast activity. They are, of course, secreted from the sex organs, the testes in men, ovaries in women, and also from body fat. The growth spurt of children during adolescence is caused by the sex organs releasing much sex hormone. Sex hormones also cause the epiphyseal plates in the long bones to ossify, and as a result then stops bone growth. So they start rapid bone growth during puberty and then stop it altogether, which is sort of a fascinating idea that one set of hormones does both. So if you would, is there questions about that stuff? And that's what I want you to know about. So in terms of the large amount of material in the text, what I have for you in your notes is the parts that I want you to be familiar with. Is there questions about that stuff? Continue then on page 110. The 3 major types of joints in the skeleton. And so these joints are described for you here in terms of examples of fibrous and cartilaginous joints. And then on page 113, there are the synovial joints. And that's really the last part of what we're going to be discussing, is the synovial joints and their function. And so, but let's look at what we got now. So the joints, of course, are places where different bones are joined, and they literally allow the skeleton to move. I mean, if you're just one solid mass of bone, you know, how would you do that? You couldn't even do that, you know? You just, I don't know. How do you move? But anyway, yeah, we're jointed, so we get to move. Movement is caused by the muscles. The 3 types are fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. Anybody ever been to that joint? No, okay. Fibrous joints consists of 2 bones, which are joined together with fibrous connective tissue. They are either immovable or slightly movable. They are further classified as suture immovable. Think about the bones of the skull, all right? So as an infant, those bones have not come together, and yet as you mature and grow, those bones do come together, and they are then they're put together at that suture, but they really don't move. And the syndesmosis, that's a fibrous connection between the two bones that are farther away from each other compared to the bones in a suture and are slightly movable. Think about the radius and the ulna. So the two bones here in your arm. I'm on page 111, and there is the fibrous joints depicted for you. I think the pictures can explain it better than my trying to show you. But in terms of the radius and the ulna, again, you see that there is a connection between them, and there's not much movement, but there is some. Very little movement there in the sutures in the skull. Let's look at the cartilaginous joints. They're depicted with the same figure. There are points at which bones are united with fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. They are movable or slightly movable and can be further classified as synchondrosis. I thought I'd spit that out. Synchondrosis joints. I kind of like that. And those are joints made by hyaline cartilage. The epiphyseal plates in an immature bone and pieces of cartilage which attach the ribs to the sternum. So you see the synchondrosis, synchondrosis. I knew I'd get that eventually. There in the ribs. So again, you can envision slight movement within the ribs, but not a whole lot. And then there is also the symphysis bones joined by fibrocartilage. The symphysis is the pubis and the intervertebral discs. So in terms of that symphysis, your pelvis is actually three bones that have formed, that have come together, and the symphysis there at the pubis. Let's keep moving on page 5 at the top. The last is the synovial joints, and they are the most complex, and they are the ones we will spend a little bit of time with, and they are well depicted too in terms of your textbook. There's a blow-up of one, and then we'll look at the individual types. So the synovial joints, I'm again at the top of page 5, allows for movement of the skeleton, and there are 6 major types of synovial joints. There's the ball and socket joint, there is a hinge joint, a saddle joint, a plane or gliding joint, a pivot joint, and an ellipsoid joint. They contain synovial fluid. More complex they are than the other 2 types of joints that we've described, and obviously that would make sense because the cartilaginous and fibrous joints, well, they barely move. They are very efficient in allowing movement, and they are covered with articular cartilage made of hyaline cartilage, which is like the hard plastic. Again, if you eat a chicken leg, you see hyaline cartilage there in terms of that. The hard plastic helps the bones in the joint to move, and it prevents damage. You have to understand, anytime you move anything against anything, even if it's lubricated, there is going to be friction, and when you have friction to the articular cartilage, that causes heat and a reduction of efficiency and motion and tissue damage if left on its own. However, the synovial joints are surrounded by, and we'll discuss that briefly in just a second, but just to remind you, that's the issue of life, of course, because anytime you move anything against anything, you're causing friction, and the result of that friction, of course, is the production of heat, and the production of heat usually swells whatever is being heated, and so joints become very often less efficient in the process of that. So the synovial joints are surrounded by an articular capsule or joint capsule. So notice the synovial joint blew up on page 111 there, and so you get an idea there in terms of that synovial capsule, that joint capsule. It's a 2-layer sac, the outer of which is the fibrous capsule. So you see that depicted there in terms of the purple that gets very thin as it goes towards the top and a little thicker as down below. But you see the fibrous capsule is in the brown. I'm sorry about that. I was looking at the line from the synovial membrane. So it is the outer one, and it surrounds the whole thing, and it's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's an extension of the outer layer of periosteum and helps hold the bones in the joint together. Sometimes this forms ligaments. Ligaments are dense, regular connective tissue that add more stability and strength to the joints. If the articular capsule extends well beyond the joint, it's called a bursa, and that provides for a fluid-filled cushion between the bone and bone, or bone and tendon. So bursitis is an inflammation of the bursa, causing pain and restricted movement. So when I was young, maybe in my early teens, my dad used to complain about bursitis. Oh, I got the bursitis in my shoulders, and it just hurts like heck in terms of this bursitis. And what he was talking about, of course, is bursitis, and that is inflammation, and it's usually repetitive motion inflammation. In other words, you're doing something a lot, and once again, you cause friction, and then sometimes fluid is restricted, or even it is diminished. And so inflammation, then you have ligaments rubbing on the hard surfaces in a joint, and the result is real pain. And so the goal is to reduce inflammation, and you can take some, sometimes medications are prescribed or just over-the-counter stuff, and then there's natural stuff that did it. So I get to my 50s or so, and I start having the bursitis. It was never officially diagnosed, but I know one thing: if I'm in the car and I reach to the back to try to get something and lift it, oh my goodness gracious! Felt like my arm was being torn out at the shoulder socket, and that is that inflammation. And as a matter of fact, began a regimen of some natural stuff, curcumin, as a matter of fact, which helped that. And again, I'm not a shill-in for the curcumin business, but sure did help me. So in terms of my bursitis, it's much better. The synovial membrane is the inner layer of the articular capsule. It's a collection of cells which produce the fluid, the synovial fluid, and the fluid is made of blood plasma and chemicals such as proteins, fats, and polysaccharides. The hyaluronic acid is an important polysaccharide that makes the synovial fluid, and it's very slippery. It's kind of an egg white looking stuff. Ovial means egg-like. That lubricates the joint, reducing the friction between the articular cartilage and the two bones. So you see the synovial membrane. Like I said, I was pointing to, I told you to look at the synovial membrane when I was actually wanting you to see the fibrous capsule there. But in any respect, there's the synovial membrane, and it surrounds there the joint, and you see the fluid as well, the synovial fluid, in terms of it being pointed out. Sometimes as we age, if that fluid is diminished. I have a dear friend who is actually at the Mayo Clinic today. Lord bless Gene. Please bless my friend Gene. He has no fluid in his shoulders, and as a result has tremendous pain, and so he's ultimately perhaps going to need a pair of shoulder replacements, but has no way to do that right now in terms of his work. Can't stop to do the recovery to have them, but they're going to look at him today at Cleveland Clinic. I hope they can come up with some answers. Let's talk about the types of joints. So turn over to page 113. We're doing good this morning. So there's ball and socket, there's hinge, saddle, ellipsoid, pivot, and plane or gliding. And you see them sort of illustrated there on page 113. The first is ball and socket, and as you can envision, a ball in a socket would allow for the highest range of motion. So it's motion in all directions, all right? You know, leg down there too. What's that?
I can't imagine having that in your arms, like in this area.
Yeah.
Imagine having that in that.
Exactly. Exactly. So it turns out that's a hinge joint in terms of your elbow, but we'll look at that in a second. So the ball and socket provide motion in all directions. The joint consists of a rounded head, that's the ball, on the end of one bone resting in a rounded depression, that's the socket, on the end of the other bone. And so think of the hip and the shoulder joints. That's what we're really talking about there for ball and socket. Hinge joint does not offer as wide a range of motion. There's really only motion in one plane as on a hinge, and it's composed of a cylinder at the end of one bone resting in a cylindrical depression at the end of the other bone. So think of the elbow and again the knee. So you know the horrible videos of you know, athletes and getting hit in a way or doing something in such a way as to make those hinge joints go in directions that they were not supposed to go. They're just terrifying to look at and horrible to experience, of course. Saddle joints are larger range of motion than hinge joints, but not quite as much as ball and socket. They do not allow rotation. They are composed of two saddle-shaped bones that are oriented perpendicular to one another. Think about the thumb's carpal to its metacarpal. So in terms of saddle joints, and you see that's what's indicated there. So in terms, it allows motion except for rotation. Ellipsoid joints the range of motion is similar to ball and socket, but with less rotation. And similar to saddle, they are elliptically shaped. So think about the wrist. So that does give you some rotation, but not as much then as a ball and socket. Pivot joints allow for only partial rotation motion. They're formed when a process of one bone is surrounded by a ring of another bone. So the second cervical vertebra, called the axis, has a long process called the dens that pokes through the foramen of the first cervical vertebra, and it's called the atlas. So that's what is depicted there in terms of the pivot joint up, and you see it pointing to for crying out loud, the two cervical vertebra. You can't exactly see those vertebrae, but they're pointing towards them. And again, that allows for some rotation motion as a result of its anatomy. And the final is the plane or gliding joint. And there's very little motion in this type of joint. It consists of two flat surfaces of about equal size, which slide against one another. The process from the scapula runs against a process in the clavicle to make it a gliding joint. So each vertebra has a superior articular process and an inferior articular process, the joint between which is called a gliding joint. So in terms of the gliding joints, You know, that's a bit of the motion there in terms of it. So there you go. So the A and P guy was dancing today in class. But anyway, that's a plain joint. The reason joints differ is because they're all designed for specific tasks. So some joints offer a wide range of motion that can't hold a lot of weight or take stress. If you would, turn over to the next page. And then that's what we're finishing up with today in terms of motion and terms of movement. So these terms, the only way I know for you to become familiar with them is just to mess around with them. Practice them on your own. I mean, literally to practice them and say them out loud in terms of what you're doing. And again, hopefully you won't get accused of trying to dance in a weird way. So, in order to understand motion, there is a need for a point of reference, a position relative to the change. So, in other words, to understand what is moving and how it's moving, you have to have something to start from, all right? And that starting point in human anatomy is the point of reference or the anatomical position. An anatomical position is required when you stand erect with feet facing forward, upper limbs hanging at the sides, palms facing forward with thumbs to the outside. So this is what we're talking about in terms of anatomical position, all right? Erect, feet forward, hands to the side. And that, of course, is described for you on page 116, figure 4.9. So, based on that position, certain terms for direction can then be defined, all right? What it means when you move from that position. So superior means above or up, used in reference to the head, the neck, and the trunk. So anything superior is that away or up and above. Inferior means below or down in reference to the head, neck, and trunk. Proximal is nearest to the trunk in reference to the limbs, all right? So proximal has to do with how close to the trunk your limbs are. Distal has to do with distance to the trunk, and again is used in reference to the limbs. So distal is away from the trunk. Proximal is towards it. Again, I apologize. Sinus stuff. Anterior is front. So this is anterior. Posterior is back. Midline is the imaginary line that runs down the center of the body, separating the right side from the left side. Can also refer to an imaginary line running down the middle of any structure. So notice midline here in terms of the anatomical position. So there is midline right down the middle, but also in terms of if you have a hand, you could also describe a midline down the middle of your hand. Same thing for a foot. So again, it's something that separates right from left. The mid-sagittal plane is similar to midline in the sense that it's an imaginary plane that divides the body into two equal left and right halves. So in terms of the mid-sagittal plane, it's as if you went all the way through and bisected the human body. Lateral is the part of the body located away from the midline, and medial is part of the body located close to the midline. So if you're talking about something lateral, you're talking about something away from the midline, and then medial is something towards the midline. Extension generally means to straighten a joint, so this is extending the elbow. Flexion means to decrease the angle between the bones of the joint. So it's the opposite of extension. So flexing the biceps, you know, I can't do this too much or I'll rip out my coat. What are you laughing about?
I'll rip out your elbow.
I'll rip out the middle is what I'll rip out. But anyway, so that's flexion. It's flexing the biceps. It's the fetal position, all right? It's finger joints. It's wrists and elbows and shoulders and vertebral column, hips, knees, toe joints. They can all flex or extend, all right? So again, the difference, flexion means to sort of bend towards, two bones towards one another. Extension means to straighten them. Plantar flexion means moving the ankle to stand on the tippy toes. So in that respect, you know, you think of flexing, and you'd think of, no, that would mean bringing the toe up, but it's the opposite. So plantar flexion means to stand on your tippy toes. That's what I got to do now to be as tall as my son. So, which is really an amazing thing. But dorsiflexion means moving the ankle so that the angle between the foot and tibia decreases. So that is the moving up of the foot. Abduction means joints move bones away from the midline, moving fingers away from imaginary line down the middle of the hand. So there is abduction, all right? That's abduction. That is abduction of the limbs. Adduction means that you move towards the midline. Moving the fingers back to duction is adduction. Moving the arms back together is adduction. And standing in the anatomical position, moving a raised arm back to the side. So that's what we're talking in terms of adduction. Inversion is the foot turned inward. The ankle is performing an inversion. So if your foot was like this and you move it in, that's inversion. Eversion is to turn the foot outward. The ankle is performing eversion. So again, eversion is, here we go. Anybody know who Charlie Chaplin is? Anybody ever heard of that name? Good. All right. So that's eversion. All right. That's Charlie Chaplin. And then pigeon-toed, I suppose. That's I don't know. I know there's some character that we used to walk pigeon-toed. That's inversion. Circumduction is the circular motion performed by ball and socket joints, moving the arms in a circular motion, moving the hip in a ball in a socket. So that is circumduction. Rotation is when a joint turns a bone on its axis, and there's two kinds. Medial rotation means rotating towards the midline. Lateral rotation is rotation away from the midline. The shoulder and hip joints allow for both of those things, for rotating towards the midline and away. And then finally, we've got pronation and supination. Pronation refers only to the unique rotation of the forearm. The rotation of the forearm so that the palm faces inferior, which is down, or posterior, which is back. Okay, so here we've got inferior, we've got posterior, or we've got it's inferior. That's right. Inferior, and posterior. All right. Inferior, posterior. There we go. And supination refers only to the unique rotation of the forearm, rotating the forearm so that the palm faces superior up and anterior forward, making sort of a bowl of soup with the hand. So in terms of that, let me see if I had that right. Let's see. Pronation. Yeah, that's right. Okay, pronation is this and that, and this is supination, and then backwards in terms of that. So The little depictions there for you will remind you of these terms, figure 410, and of course 4-9 is the anatomical position, and the other terms reflecting that. Again, any of you artists, it's extra credit and it's reminders, so any of you who want to draw that would be an excellent sort of thing to draw. We have reached the end, and we have made it. We've done okay. I still have to call you up and check your homework if you haven't turned it in, and get your test. But is there any questions about any of this fun stuff? Kind of like this stuff. Kind of like this. Anything at all? Well, y'all have a great week.